Hey guys, Christian Murray here, co-publisher of the Queen's Post. Today I'm going to be talking to Jaslin Kaur. She's a council candidate for the 23rd District. Hi Jaslin, thank you very much for joining me today.
Of course, thanks so much for having me.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. So look, just tell people a little bit about yourself and why you're running for office.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Jaslin Kaur. I'm a Democratic candidate for New York City Council right in my home of District 23. I was born and raised here myself, went to our public schools, ride our public transit, and I've spent years doing education activist work to support education equity and making sure we're creating and crafting student misconduct codes that protect against gender discrimination in our schools. And I've also spent a number of years working to protect the right to healthcare for many undocumented immigrants and many Asian immigrant families across the United States. And I'm running for city council because I know that this is a seat that is going to be really important to expand civic engagement for many folks in New York City and in our district. And it's an opportunity for us to build out a people-powered grassroots movement that is really going to bring the concerns of District 23, the place that I've always called home, into a new generation of political leadership as well.
All right, Jaslin. So just tell us a little bit about, what you do for an occupation and, what you're doing on a civic level in terms of, community groups and things. If you could just sort of, give people a bit of a rundown as to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I currently organize with a group that's called Know Your Nine, where we work on Title IX policy in many of our K through 12 schools and colleges and universities. So we do a lot of policy advocacy at the state and federal level to make sure that students have a safe environment in their schools, and so that we can expand some of the most basic resources, including mental health care that is really top of mind for many students who are struggling in this COVID-19 pandemic, expand restorative justice programs so students aren't getting pushed out of school, and push for Title IX policy that actually keeps students safe and doesn't resort to students being subject to sexual violence, harassment, or gender discrimination on campus. And I also recently worked at New American Leaders, where we actually train many of whom are women of color, running for office for the first time to make sure that they can run, win, and govern their communities across the United States. And, I think it's really important for us to build out local politics and build out local civic engagement. So I have spent about a year or two actually doing mutual aid work during this pandemic to try to reach so many seniors and homebound folks who would be food insecure if they didn't have these resources at their hands. And we've also been signing up many seniors as well to sign them up for their vaccine appointments, knowing that accessibility in our district has just been really awful for many people to actually make sure that they get taken care of and that we're mitigating this public health crisis.
Okay, terrific. Now, Jaslin, you mentioned that you're born and raised in this district. Can you just tell us a little bit where you're born and where you were raised in the district? And furthermore, what are the most pressing needs that you see on a very local level in this district?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm born and raised in Glen Oaks. I live with my family out here, and it's really just an absolute joy to be able to run and to represent the same communities that raised me. And I
Hmm.
think what's really come to mind, especially in this district, is that there have been many issues that people have run on, but have not been resolved in the past few years. And one of the things that I think is really important is around expanded senior care and home care programs for many folks who are homebound. And also given that we have one of the largest, if not the largest senior population out of all council districts across New York City.
Hmm.
We're a naturally occurring retirement community or in Newark. And, I think it's especially devastating knowing that in this COVID-19 pandemic, the Parker Jewish Institute that falls just inside of our district was home to the largest number of nursing home deaths in the entire city at 119. So we lost folks who should still be with us today. And I think that we need to definitely expand services for many of our home care workers who definitely need increased pay and increased services as well, but also expand bilingual care services. I myself was a caretaker for my grandmother before she passed away, and I was often the only one who was able to speak a language to translate between doctors. So I think that's definitely at top of mind for me.
Hmm.
And another that's really become a critical concern, especially in the southern part of the district, is around street safety and good street planning. So I hear all the time on the doors of not enough potholes being filled in our district, not enough stop signs and speed bumps to actually mitigate over speeding and reckless driving that we've seen in the district. And there's definitely been an uptick in that reckless driving over the course of this pandemic as more folks are relying on their cars to get around. So, mitigate that.
Are there any particular trouble spots, any particular areas in the district that you think that DOT should be looking at closely?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Jamaica Avenue and Hillside Avenue are some of the really major hubs of our district where we see a lot of increased traffic and a lot of congestion actually during rush hour as well. There's a particular intersection, Hillside Avenue and Springfield Boulevard in our district, that is also a very dangerous place for many pedestrians to cross, and don't have many seniors and folks with disabilities aren't able to cross safely in time and are often waiting at the islands in between the intersection. And I've made quite a few reports of myself to DOT and 311, and I've heard that many of our neighbors are having trouble with actually getting their requests met. So these are some of the things that are really important out here.
All right, okay. In terms of just sort of moving on to different topics for a second, the budget, of course, in 2020, or I guess fiscal year 2021, was very heavily debated, particularly regarding the NYPD. What's your view on the NYPD, given the last 12 months and the George Floyd scenario and all the rest of it, and how ugly it's all gotten? What would you do if you're in the council and such a budget was put forward, $6 billion for the NYPD? Where would you go with that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this past year has really elevated so many instances of broken windows policing that has still lingered in New York City, that has targeted so many of our Black and brown neighbors, has increased incarceration and surveillance. And I think as a young South Asian woman and the daughter of immigrants, it was communities like mine, South Asians, Arabs, Muslims, Sikhs, who were targeted and surveilled by the NYPD as well, and back in immediately after 9/11. So that's something that's very, concerning to me personally. But I think that when we think about a system that is racially just, it means that we use our budget meaningfully and make it a people's budget. And so I personally would not have voted for that budget negotiation in 2020, knowing that originally they had stated that they would defund the NYPD by $1 billion. But what really ended up happening was that we defunded so many other important New York City agencies like the Sanitation Department and the Parks Department as well. So many neighbors have complained to me about the increase in trash and littering and pollution in their neighborhoods. And that's a direct result of a budget that didn't have its priorities in mind for our local communities. And so, I think something that we really need to do differently right here in New York City is expand the city council's oversight over the NYPD, knowing that we have a number of repeat offenders who are NYPD officers who have been complicit in much of the violence against our Black and brown communities. And one of the ways we can do that is with an elected citizen complaint review board. Mm-hmm. Currently, the mayor selects our police commissioner, Dermot Shea, and appoints many of the members of the citizen complaint review board as well. So the more democratic we can make this process, I think we'll have even more accountability so that our tax dollars actually go towards community-based solutions and funding for community-based organizations to do the rapid response, include more social workers into our community response, and make sure that our families are really kept safe out here.
Right. But you'd reduce the budget from 6 billion to a smaller amount and reallocate the 6 billion to other areas, or would you just sort of just cut it back, period?
Yeah, so I think that we absolutely need to redirect some of these funds to other social safety nets that we know can actually keep people safe. So when we think about how, we've increased rates of incarceration and managed to keep Rikers Island open, what really keeps people safe is avenues towards the most basic foundations of human life: housing, healthcare, and education. Folks who, in our district, actually, at Rikers Island, some folks were temporarily held at a hotel in Fresh Meadows because they would otherwise be homeless. Mm-hmm. And they would otherwise be exposed to the COVID-19 pandemic, and we could have lost them too. These are people who deserve a dignified life, who deserve the right to safety as well. And so I think that, fully funding our public schools, which I think is something that's also really exciting, knowing that our state legislature will be instituting about $4 billion to our New York City public schools, and making sure that that's equitably funded, and making sure that people can continue to be permanently housed. I think these definitely have to be what our priorities are in our budget.
Okay. Do you think Dermot Shea's done a good job?
I don't really think so. I think that we've seen an increase of military style police violence, especially against protesters, press, and people who are asking for racial justice in our city. We've also seen an increased number of homelessness in New York City, over 60,000 people who continue to be homeless, but NYPD is still doing homeless outreach, and we're not listening to the direct needs of what our community members actually need. And so given that we have seen so much brutality in our own streets, continued surveillance and expansion of police within our schools, and continued incarceration of people who may never get the care and attention that they desperately need to live a dignified life, I don't think that he's done a great job for our city.
Okay, no, understood. Um, okay, Jaslin, what would you do though to address homelessness? Whenever a shelter is, sited in a hotel or wherever, you'll often get community outrage. It's just, I guess, the way it goes everywhere.
Right.
How would you tackle that issue?
Yeah, so we've actually had a little bit of an uproar in the Community Board District 11
Mm,
over an adult women's shelter that was proposed to be built, right? That would
mm,
give housing for 75 adult women who would otherwise be homeless. And I think that there's even an uproar over that signals that we are lacking a little bit of compassion and empathy for people who need somewhere to live. And these are our neighbors. I remember talking to a community member in Glen Oaks as well, who started tearing up because he is so upset with seeing people who are begging for the most basic components of a human life being denied that right to housing. And so I do believe that we need expansion of shelters. These are temporary solutions. And I think emergency situations where folks who are suddenly unemployed, folks who are experiencing instances of domestic violence. I myself have worked with survivors of domestic violence who need, a place for them to go and a place to keep their children safe and continue to live their lives. We need expanded shelters, but we also need more solutions and increase the stock of public housing. Just in our state budget, we could have expanded opportunities for rent relief for many of our tenants who could be at risk of eviction, and many of our homeowners as well who are at risk of foreclosure. So one plan that we're exploring actually is around community land trusts, so that folks aren't at risk of homelessness, or homeowners aren't at risk of homelessness. They can no longer pay their property taxes. And that's something else that so many neighbors are complaining about, that the value of their homes are going up, but their salaries aren't going up as well to actually being able to pay the home taxes that are tripled and quadrupling in so many cases as well. So whatever we can do to do foreclosure prevention, keep people permanently housed and making sure that they're not subject to a tax lien and losing their home as well. I think these are the real material solutions that can actually build housing equity across our city.
So there's been a lot of criticism in terms of the affordable housing programs out there, in terms of the income thresholds. You have these area median incomes to qualify for affordable housing that many deem are too high, and it accompanies the mandatory inclusionary housing program that go with rezonings. Now, if you're a minimum wage earner earning $15 an hour, you're not going to qualify for a lot of this stuff. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think that it's shameful that affordable housing units that are being proposed in some developments are close to $2,000 in monthly rent. That is absolutely not what the average working family can afford in New York City. And so I think a fair AMI rate is between 0 and 30% to actually increase the stock of affordable housing in New York City so that our families aren't being priced out. And that's the larger discussion about zonings, about ULURP process as well, in terms of how we're using our land use policy meaningfully to increase the stock of public housing and affordable housing as well. It's very clear that even our residents in NYCHA are being subject to privatization with the RAD program, and folks are seeing their rents increase and aren't being given the kind of legal attention and legal aid that they need to prevent eviction as well. So I think that we absolutely need to use our land use meaningfully and look at our zoning policies to see, are we as council members, right, hopefully if elected, I would have to really use my powers to make sure that we're using local hiring mandates as well to hire union to build these developments, to make a commitment to affordable housing and 100% affordable housing in these developments to make sure that our community members aren't being displaced.
Jaslin, would you change the ULIP process in terms of the rezonings? The public process in which land is rezoned. What are your thoughts on that, and do you think it needs to be reformed?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the process itself is bureaucratic, often very time consuming as well. And currently, even our community board members and our Queensborough president only really have an advisory role and
Mm,
don't really have a lot of decision making power in exactly how we move forward these developments as well. But I think even with the City Planning Commission, we have a lot of folks who have hands in REBNY or the Real Estate Board of New York, and aren't city planners, aren't urban planners, aren't people who actually know the deep concerns of folks who are on the ground who are at risk of homelessness too. So I think expanding opportunities for us to appoint actual tenant leaders, housing advocates as well to be part of this process will really help make our city incredibly more equitable.
hmm I mean, a lot of people view ULIP as like city planning driven, that sometimes city planning isn't really on the side of the public, that they're sort of working in tandem with developers. Would you agree with that? And what would you sort of, how would you change that?
Yeah, again, it's become incredibly clear that the real estate lobby has had such a stronghold on New York City politics and is able to influence everything from donations to political campaigns to deciding whether we continue to build developments that are pricing our neighbors out. And
hmm
so, we recently wanted to have the appointment of Sia Weaver that was also rolled back by public advocate Jimani Williams as well. And I think that could have been a more useful appointment for us to add folks to our planning commission who are actually have a temperature check and a finger on the pulse of people and what they actually need to be built in the city to make sure that the rent isn't skyrocketing, that we expand the right to counsel as well, and people who are really on the side of folks who are going to be displaced otherwise.
What are your thoughts on member deference, where the city council member of a district ultimately gets to say in terms of a rezoning? The city council basically votes in lockstep with that council member. Do you think that's a practice that should continue?
Yeah, I think that member deference has continued to introduce even more developments across our city that have continued to displace people. And I think that, while absolutely the council member of that district would certainly have, a more nuanced understanding of what exactly the temperature and the playing field of that district are, I think we have multiple city council members for a reason, and multiple advocacy groups here as well who can push our legislation in the right direction. I mean, just look at what happened with the Flushing rezoning as
Mm.
well. Peter Koo, Councilmember Peter Koo, was in favor of moving this Flushing waterfront forward, this development plan forward, that would have actually increased street congestion in an already, I believe, the second largest transit hub in all of New York City. The environmental impact study was severely underwhelming and would increase pollution, local pollution in the area, and would, really drive up rent costs in the area, especially for many, working class Asian families in that district who would otherwise be displaced and would otherwise be relegated to homelessness. So I think that member deference really has not worked out so much for our city, and we need a more holistic solution that can actually account for the multiple voices in our council, raise the voices of tenant advocates and housing advocates in our city instead.
All right, terrific. Jaslin, I want to talk about education, just one component of it for a second. Gifted and talented programs. Some argue that gifted and talented programs, result in sort of segregation. There's some sort of not racist, but racial component of it, whereby a lot of kids of sort of Asian and white backgrounds sort of go in the gifted and talented, and then you've got other people that are not, and it sort of creates a system that maybe isn't equitable. What are your thoughts on that program, and do you think it should continue?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of parents, especially in our own district, really want to see gifted and talented continue. They want to see specialized high schools expanded into the district as well. But I think it's distracting us from a conversation about just how inequitable our current school system is. We have one of the most segregated school systems, if not the most segregated school system in the entire country. And that's a point of inequitable school funding, inequitable PTA funding as well, and really points to how zip codes and income and wealth determine the quality of your students' education. And so, for me, I think that, we need a freeze on charter schools. We need to, freeze on the gifted and talented programs and really expand opportunities for us to end the digital divide in our schools, especially during this pandemic. And I think even just our school district 26 that covers so much of council district 23 has been such a great model too for what the quality of our schools can be. I mean, I myself went to PS 115 that is now a blue ribbon school and sends so much incredible talent out to the rest of New York City and educates the future of our students so well. But I think the larger conversation here is really on equitable funding and making sure that we're not increasing policing, we're not pushing students out of school, and making sure that the quality of every single school is actually brought up to date.
Okay. Now, Jaslin, when you say a freeze on gifted and talented, are you meaning ending it, or what do you kind of mean by freeze?
As in, we shouldn't expand gifted and talented programs, that we should, definitely focus our attention towards building up our public schools and making sure that we're reducing overcrowding, expanding bilingual services, mental health care programs, things like that.
But you're saying that it should be kept, just not expanded on.
That's right.
Yeah. All right. Okay. In terms of, just to finish up, you touched on transportation at the beginning of our conversation. Areas out here, it's pretty tough if you rely on public transportation to get around the borough, get to Manhattan if that's where you want to go. So what would you do to improve that if you were in the council?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, District 23 is a transportation desert. I myself have run across Union Turnpike to catch the Q46 bus and have had 3 buses move past me, 3 empty buses that have moved past me. And, before this pandemic, the travel times during rush hour to the Kew Gardens train station or the Jamaica 179th Street station as well also increased to about 40 to 45 minutes because the buses are often spending time merging in and out of traffic and trying to move through incredibly congested streets. So there was actually a really interesting vote that came before Community Board 11 to introduce a study on a potential protected bus lane down Union Turnpike, which I think would be an really exciting initiative to move forward on, and also expanding bike lanes and the network of connected bike lanes across Queens and Brooklyn too. The East Queens Greenway is one of the most exciting local projects that I think has been implemented in our district to expand protected bike lanes. And our team actually attended an informative session and community session with the DOT about where these connected routes can go. And one of the ones that we actually explored was bike lanes that connect to schools like Queensborough Community College. So to incentivize more bike riding, more safe bike riding, and expanding bike shares as well. Something that I would really love to get back to is riding my bike and knowing that it's a safe option and not having to drive to the nearest bike share. That's incredibly ironic. I don't think that's something that we should do. And really expanding opportunities for streets to be truly shared among cars, bikes, and buses. So we have multimodal transportation options and really make sure that we're reducing collisions, reducing crashes as well, and keeping our streets as safe as possible.
Do you think City Bike could ever make it out this far east?
Well, it doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. The only proposals I've seen for new city bike hubs have been in Western Queens.
Yeah,
I think they've started to get into Sunnyside and not so much out here. So I think it'll definitely take some time, which means that maybe we can expand bike co-ops in the district and protected bike parking as well, knowing that many delivery workers have also seen bike theft, e-bike theft during the course of this pandemic, and really make sure that we can expand the opportunities for us to get out there and get to our parks without having to drive there.
Yeah, I mean, you take Jamaica Avenue, Hillside Avenue, Union Turnpike, they are busy roads. Riding a bicycle on Jamaica Avenue, riding a bicycle on Hillside Avenue would make me very nervous the way it is now. Do you think it could be that the roadway could be transformed where you could get protected bicycle lanes on there, or would you have to sort of find alternative routes that sort of pretty much do the same thing but sort of weave in and out? Have you sort of looked at that at all?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a greater question about urban planning, right? You can't just put a bike line there because it seems like the right thing to do. It has to connect to other transportation hubs. It has to connect to other larger bike lanes across Queens and across the district as well. So we can't just stick a bike lane down Jamaica Avenue because it sounds like the right thing to do. That's, not really what we're proposing here. But, opportunities for us to make sure that these bike lanes are protected. And, we've been working with folks on the Transportation Committee, actually, of Community Board 11 to help us map out where are the safest places for these bike lanes to go, making sure they connect to the right places where we see a lot of traffic going, and increasing that safety. I mean, these are the things that we think we would really need to have to expand.
All right,
And of
Jaslin.
course,
Yeah, go ahead.
no, I mean, I would just add that, so many of these streets are also quite narrow. So making sure that we're using it meaningfully so we can have the bus lanes and car lanes used meaningfully as well. I think that's also something we have to take into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Jaslin, just to finish up, is there any sort of topics that you're running on that you think people should be aware of? I mean, you mentioned things that are dear to your heart in terms of senior, looking after seniors, especially post-pandemic and traffic incidents. Are there any other topics that, you are going to focus on closely and are sort of very, matter a lot to you individually?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm the daughter of a taxi driver. My father has been driving his yellow cab for close to 30 years now, and he's going into his senior years and actually never stopped driving throughout this entire pandemic. I know too many families in our district, in our community network, who have had to sell their homes and move out because they're not making enough to support their families and have had to forfeit their medallions. I mean, just look, we passed over a $2 billion excluded worker fund in the state legislature that will help so many of our workers here in New York City. But the New York Taxi Workers Alliance is still protesting every single day outside City Hall, demanding debt forgiveness so that we can continue to live our lives with dignity. And, these are people who are seniors themselves, people who are working class immigrants who were promised prosperity on that taxi medallion that was supposed to be valued at well over $1 million. If my father isn't able to get the debt relief that he needs, I will be the one who will continue to have to make these payments to brokers who really sold out our families. So, we're exploring so many opportunities at the federal level. I believe Gregory Meeks is carrying a bill in Congress. At the state level, calling on Governor Cuomo to expand these bills. And state senators Jessica Ramos and Leroy Comrie have a really expansive bill that would expand service and care for many of our workers. And at the city level, I think the city council can really expand oversight over city agencies like the New York Taxi and Limousine Commission to make sure that we have return pensions, healthcare, and just the basic facets of a good, work that is unionized as well, to make sure that our workforce doesn't continue to be pushed out of New York City and can continue to afford to live here.
Okay. Well, Jaslin, thank you very much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure to speak with you, Christian.